Hi, welcome to the Daiku Podcast. I'm Gary Snow. Today I welcome Leo Hunt, the creative mind behind Vaults of Vaarn. It's widely admired in the OSR community, and Leo is now on the cusp of releasing the Shrike, which is a dark fantasy sandbox adventure in a derelict limbo of rusted iron, saltwater, stone, and blood. It's designed for old school essentials, and we're going to learn all about it in the next few minutes. But first of all, Leo, welcome.
Hi, Gary. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, as I mentioned, Vaults of Vaarn, people love Vaults of Vaarn. You must know that by now, and it's one of those foundational games in the OSR. So you should be very proud of it. And we're going to talk about Vaults of Vaarn and the Shrike coming up. But first of all, tell us, how did you get involved in this crazy little hobby of ours?
Oh yeah, so I'm kind of like an interloper. Like I'm pretty much a newcomer. I weirdly although like all of my interests seem like they should push me towards the space, I had never played in a tabletop role-playing game until I was like in my late 20s. And it was really like only in COVID I started listening to some like actual play podcast, and I was kind of like, oh, this actually seems like it could be really fun and like something that I could do. So I started I ran a few Call of Cthulhu and like Delta Green games, and like I enjoyed them. And like I played in 5e like a little bit, and I had some issues with it that I think a lot of people who are into the OSR would probably share. Although I kind of came to mine, I think, like just through experiencing it, you know. And then I kind of got more interested in the indie side, and I started reading loads of stuff, and I found things like White Hack and like Into the Odds, and I was like, oh wow, this is like completely different to how I felt reading through the 5e Game Master book, which just kind of bored me, and I felt like I got confused. Whereas Into the Odd, I was like, oh, I understand how to like play this immediately. And that's kind of how I got, that's kind of my route in a nutshell. And then like, I wanted to do like my own proper like campaign. And that's when Varn kind of happened, because I started like, I knew that I didn't want to do kind of like elves and orcs and stuff. So I started just thinking of all the things that I really liked and like drawing them into this one kind of weird like bucket. And that's kind of how it started.
So maybe if we could back up a sec, you said reflecting upon it, maybe all these things should have been pushing you towards the game hobby to begin with. So what were you like growing up? And that do you think that should have happened?
I think just I kind of if I can grossly stereotype about people who are into these things, it's usually imaginative introverts who like read a lot, are kind of interested in, you know, both like the history of our world and like the rich kind of literature about other like imagined worlds. And you know, the kind of it's someone who's going to get like very, very into like thinking about all this stuff and like detailing all these maps on little bits of paper. And I did all of that, but I never like connected it with Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, which is probably just a quirk of fate. I think I didn't know anybody who was into it, and I think I had like the idea that like, oh well, we have video games now, so I don't need like RPGs. I'm not saying I think that now. It's just when I was a teenager, I think that would have been my attitude, even though like looking back, I was obviously crying out for the hobby, but I just didn't find it.
And so you were always kind of intrigued by science fiction, fantasy to begin with. Did you have any kind of influences in that area in particular?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, where do you start? That's always been like my my kind of obsession. When I was a kid, what was it? I love stuff like the Edge Chronicles. I don't know if you had those in America.
No.
They're these like UK children's books that are kind of mental. I mean, they could actually be like a campaign setting. It's like this giant like cliff that juts out over nothingness, and there's like a city on it and like a forest and loads of weird like goblins and stuff that live on it. And it goes on for like books and books and books, and it's all fully illustrated as well. So they have these like sky ships that fly with like flying stones, and you get all these incredible diagrams of them, and like loads of kind of like pseudo naturalistic stuff about all the monsters that live on the edge. And like honestly, if people watching this haven't read those books, which I think they were UK only, seek them out, because like you could make a whole OSR setting out of those books like really, really easily.
And people at home are clamoring right now. They're like trying to type in to get IP rights to this thing.
They should be. Honestly, if I was smart, I should just file all the names off it and release it myself as like you know, I don't know, the cusp or whatever. Like it's a giant cliff face. It's slightly different, you know.
And then did you do any other exploratory beside before games? Like, did you do any like writing and art in that space as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I actually always forget to mention this, but I have been like a published author for a while. I wrote some young adult like fiction. So I wrote 4 books for young adults that came out in the UK. 3 of them did come out in America, but I know how many copies they sold, and again, no one will have like heard of them. But yeah, the first one was called 13 Days of Midnight, and it was kind of like a ghost like adventure story, which I'm still really proud of. It's like the thing that I've written that sold the most still. Um, but yeah, I've been making my living from writing kind of fantasy stuff for like 10 years. But even still, like even doing that, I didn't play an RPG until like 4 years ago. So, you know, it's just weird, isn't it? But
Well, we're glad that you finally made that connection, and there's a lot of good things that came from COVID. As I think,
absolutely, yeah.
lots of bad things, but lots of good things too that came from it. So life gives you lemons, and make lemonade. But so when did Vaults of Varn kind of emerge to you as like I'm gonna make my own game, and what was that kind of trigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing was like it started as like I was just doing it for my own kind of fun. Like I said, it was in COVID, and I think for reasons that are not like hard to explain, I just desperately wanted to be somewhere else, and I just kept imagining like I just wanted to thinking about like these Mobius pictures, and like I just wanted to step into them and like be in this kind of this huge like blue desert, with no walls, which I was spending the same day over and over again in like the same room. So it's again not really hard to understand where that impulse came from. But yeah, I just started writing that stuff, and like I was reading the OSR blogs by that point, so I was getting really inspired by like Goblin Punch and things like that, and just being like, oh, you can make this whole like world that's also a game, and like each post is like one little bit of it, and I can write it in a way that's kind of like don't know how you call it, like kind of fractal, like jigsaw. Like I don't need to know everything about it. I just need to do like one thing at a time, and like I found that quite freeing as well, actually, rather than like having a big plot. Was just being like, what kind of weird idea like interests me at the moment, and I write some stuff about that and flip back to it, and I started running the game. I think I still, in a way, I don't see it as like its own system, because it is Knave basically, but just with like a couple of house rules. I think it's different enough that like people call it its own thing, but I always thought I was like running Knave, just like quite a fleshed out campaign, that wasn't like standard like fantasy, but it uses the engine basically.
And I'm gonna pop it up onto the screen here so that we can talk about it. And so maybe just walk us through, like you did the art and you talked
Yes.
about like Mobius kind of influence, and maybe just talk to us about like your process of like when did you like start to draw it out? Was that part of the whole campaign? Like, did you do handouts, or did you have this campaign and go, oh, I'm going to make a book out of it?
So it all and good question. It all coalesced like gradually over time. I think if I'd sat down at the start and been like, I'm going to write this whole book like you got here, I would never have done it. So originally, the player's guide was literally just for my campaign, and rather than being illustrated by me, it literally was just illustrated by Mobius. I just got loads of Mobius pictures because, this wasn't a commercial product. It was for 4 people, so like you can put whatever you want in there. But I had my layout program, and I made it look like a kind of published thing. But I just put Mobius drawings in there, and that one looked pretty good. Like obviously he's a great artist, but after a few months of running the campaign, I was kind of like, well, do you know what? Why don't I just put this stuff into like a zine? Because I'd started a blog for the campaign, and it was getting some like followers, and like I was like, why don't I put out like a zine? Like this was the first issue, but obviously, I can't use Mobius artwork. I'm gonna have to like step up and draw my own stuff, which is tough because like obviously he's one of the. I was mentally like comparing myself against him, because like that was the original player's guide, had that stuff in, and I was like, well, there's no way I can match that, but I'm just gonna have to like sit down and like do my own stuff, which is what you're seeing here. Yeah, so I kind of it came from not being able to violate intellectual property rights basically, and having to draw my own illustrations instead.
Well, there's a lot of similarities. I've had Luca Reyes on the show before, and a couple times actually. And I'll put links up above to just talk about, and obviously Mobius's influence of his. And the two of you in this case have actually a lot of similarities as far as like you're writing it, you're doing the layout, you're doing the art itself. So like the triple threat, which very few people can pull off. So did you kind of know that going into it, as far as like that you're probably a pretty rare case of making your own game like this?
Yeah, I've come to realize that one thing I should say, just for credit's sake, the layout and the stuff we're looking at now is not done by me. That's done by Contigio. Although I did do the layout for the original zines, so I can do it. Just not these pages. But yeah, I think it's a big advantage. Obviously, like it didn't really. It sounds weird, but it didn't really occur to me that like I would do anything else. I knew I could write and draw, and like the layout stuff was something that I'm interested in anyway. Like I like typography and like graphic design as well as illustration. So, it turns out when there's something that you really want to put together with these programs, you can force yourself to learn them pretty quickly, because like, I wasn't just sitting down and doing tutorials. I was like sitting down with a specific problem to solve, and I would just kind of make myself like learn how to do the text and stuff. But yeah, no, I like I said, I've realized like Luca's definitely someone I look up to, and like we have a similar thing, at least in that we can do it all ourselves.
And going back to like, so it didn't start as like this omnibus that I've been kind of flipping us through with Contigio doing the layout, but you did like separate zines leading into that omnibus. So at what point did that kind of start taking off for you? Like what zine was it right off the bat? Zine one?
It basically happened immediately, and it really shot. The popularity really surprised me. Like, because to give you an idea, I kind of printed like 15 copies, and I thought, oh well, I hope I won't lose money on this, And then I think I sold 15 in like the first hour, and I was like, oh okay, this is maybe gonna be like a bit more popular than I imagined, because I think like I thought I'd done a good job, but there's so much stuff on the internet, and like I didn't really have a good answer to like why would someone want to look at my thing, But I posted about it in a couple of places, and like it got like a big response like really quickly, and started to like like I said, it sold out. Like I couldn't keep it in stock the first zine, and then like people were like writing to me with like stuff they'd drawn from like the zine, or like asking me these really in-depth questions that like indicated they read it like really carefully, and I was like, oh, people like really like this. I wasn't expecting that, So that's when I did like 2 and 3, because I was like, there's obviously more that you can add, and it kind of went from there.
And I should probably back up and go, for those of you at home, I just assume everybody knows about it, but maybe there's somebody that's stumbling across my channel and doesn't know about Vaults of Vaarn, and just kind of the premise that you've set up and why you maybe made those design choices.
Oh yeah, sure. So Vaults of Vaarn is it's a tabletop RPG setting first and foremost, which is like a giant blue desert in the like very last age of like the planet Earth. So like the sun is like this red giant that's like going out. You can see the stars during the day, and the whole world is like covered in this kind of infinite layer cake of like extinct civilizations with their own like weird artifacts and stuff. And you play as, either mutated humans, or like uplifted animals, or robots, or even weirder creatures that are kind of adventuring in this big blue desert, trying to find exotica, which are the relics of the past, basically, while avoiding being dinner for various unpleasant science fantasy kind of animals and weird bandits and stuff. So it kind of draws from like Dune, Book of the New Sun, Nausicaa, sort of Caves of Cud, the video game, stuff like that. Kind of like weird, slightly psychedelic, like retro future, like Dying Earth kind of stuff, which is a subgenre of a subgenre. So it's a very particular like flavor of science fiction, but it's one that I really like. So that's the pitch basically.
And I think there was 3 zines that eventually came to the omnibus. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. There's one, two, and three. Issue one is like the rules and a lot of like random generators. Issue two is like a full like city setting for the kind of the game, and then issue three is kind of like mostly devoted to wilderness travel, and it has this thing where you can create a point crawl by dropping a bunch of dice on a page, which I didn't invent, but people seem to like quite a lot. And so between them, they kind of give you like a full game. I'm working on issue four, but it's taken like 2 years now. So
And
hopefully I'm going to
obviously,
get. Yeah, I'm hopefully I'm going to get it out this year, but I don't know.
and you've obviously been busy with the Shrike, but
Yeah,
you eventually did you turn over publishing to Games Omnivorous as far as the omnibus?
yeah. So Andre from Games Omnivorous actually scouted me quite early. He messaged again, like he messaged me after the first zine came out. So like probably like November or December of 2021, and he was like, "Do you want to make this like a full book?" So that's like an example of like I'm not trying to brag, but it's like stuff like that took me really by surprise because I wasn't expecting to get like a publishing deal from like the first thing that I put out. But yeah, and then in between me saying yes and actually signing the contract, I did two more zines. So like we decided to put it all in one book, and that came out I think 2022. Yeah.
And then when did the Shrike start to rear its head and start to get into your mind as far as like the idea of it and what you wanted to do with it as a setting? And for I'll put it up on the screen here.
Oh yeah,
So
here we
the
go.
pitch is a dark fantasy sandbox adventure in a derelict limbo of rust, iron, saltwater, stone, and blood. And you made it for old school essentials.
Yes. Yeah, so the story here is basically Joel, who runs Silverarm. He contacted me to originally he wanted to publish Varn in a big book, but I'd literally just like signed a contract with Games Omnivorous like a month before I think, so I couldn't do it. But he said if you have any other ideas, let me know. And I kind of like said I've been thinking about like hell and kind of the afterlife as like a kind of possible setting for something different. So yeah, the pitch of the Shrike, like you said, is it's a kind of it's fantasy rather than science fiction. It's a kind of sandbox, very large like adventure in this kind of weird like prison plane that's like exists to torment this like god that you can see at the top of the giant spiky mountain, and you are kind of adventuring inside the giant iron mountain, finding probably trying to look for a way out because it's a prison, and once you're there you can't leave except by like very particular means, and even death doesn't like let you escape. You're just going to resurrect again. So yeah, the theme here was kind of like so Varn is a lot of things, but like primarily it's science fiction. It's very colorful. It's sometimes horror themed, but it's quite light-hearted as well. Or often it is like you can be like a talking animal or like a weird robot that loves alcohol or whatever. And the Shrike was like I kind of wanted to do something that wasn't. I don't want to say like the opposite of that, but it's like something very different, like mood-wise. So where Varn's dominant color is like bright blue, this one is like gray, black, red, for example, and it's it's a lot less like humorous, I think.
Yeah, it definitely has a bit of a darker tone to it.
Yes.
And as we already kind of went through, you can see one of the former zine covers that Leo had. And then also mentioned Joel from Silverarm Press, and I've had Joel on the show before, so I'll put links up above. And Desert Moon of Karth was kind of maybe his breakout, and recently Tide World of Mani. I think we never did settle on the name, but who else is on the team here?
Yeah, sure. So for illustrations, we've got Jantiff. Jan is absolutely killing it, as we'll see later. He was a tattoo artist, and like he's been an illustrator for RPGs for a while, I think. But I hadn't seen his work before this. As we'll see, I talked to Joel about maybe looking for someone who had a bit of like Gustave Doré about them, particularly his engravings for like the Divine Comedy. And Jan actually fits the bill like really well. He does that same like line art like style. It almost looks like an engraving, as we'll see. Christian has been the main like kind of sort of line editor, done an amazing job with a really enormous document. And Brad, I think people will either know from his adventures like Hideous Daylight, or probably for the podcast Between Two Cans as well, which I was an avid listener of like before he was brought into the project. So it was kind of a really nice like surprise to see him suddenly pop up in the Google document. But yeah, Brad got brought on in the first draft for like, I'd say kind of high level, like making it more kind of gamey and like making sure that there was like fun like content everywhere rather than just like paragraphs that describe something. And he did a really good job of that. And like Joel, yeah, like you said, Joel's kind of the big boss of the whole project, and is known for his mothership modules, and hopefully soon for this, and his work with Silverarm.
And you talked about the volume of text. I know it broke Google Docs. Like, how much are we looking at here?
So it's 67,000 words in the final draft, which is kind of like novel length. This is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing because I think, like many people, I do actually think that brevity has a lot of a lot of benefits in RPG writing. So trumpeting that there's so many words in this thing may put some people off. All I would say to them is that I also I believe in like minimalism and like not drowning you in text. It's just that like there are lots and lots of like little ideas in this that have kind of added up over time to something that's like got a lot of content. So my hope is that like, yeah, it's big. It's like, it's a long thing in terms of word count, but it also, I think, justifies that in terms of being very like dense with ideas and having a lot of different things in it.
So you're not just trying to beef up the word count to get paid more or anything like that. There's like some real.
I would never dream of that. No, no. I think the thing was when I pitched this was originally supposed to be about half the length, probably under, and it just kind of grew because like each component started to need like more kind of more detail and would like suggest more like connections as well. So that's kind of been a big thing, is like. Every like area and kind of character has like connections to sometimes kind of quite unexpected ones to like other things that you've seen earlier, which you know, is kind of one of the fun things about working in this format, but it does like take a lot of like getting straight in your head.
And how much did your novel experience kind of flow into that, where you're like, oh boy, there's more story to tell here?
That's an interesting question. I think the thing is, I try and avoid that novelist's instinct in some ways because, so this is a module which has like an ending, which I know may seem like a little strange thing, like it's a sandbox with an ending, but there are kind of things there are actions you can take that will fundamentally destroy or alter this weird little world that you're in. And all of the characters the action is going to be pushing you towards one of those choices basically, but like I try and let go of that thing of like there being a plot or whatever. Like there are situations and characters who want things. If you do nothing, everything will stay the same, but if you don't, like things are going to change quite drastically, and you will like hopefully will end up with some decisions to make that are going to change the whole Shrike basically. But
we've seen a couple slides here now with the intricate line work and
yes.
illustrations, and just like in the mood that it evokes, and just the darkness and the complexity. How much of it, like when you were starting out, did you have like the inspiration and brainstorming, and like did you have like kind of an art book that you went, this is what I'm going for, and or how did that process play out?
So I had like a Pinterest board for ages, which I don't actually know if John ever used, but me and Joe like kind of conversed a lot about artists, and I threw like various people out that we I won't name names, but we decided not to go for, or like we're already spoken for. But Joel is the one who recruited John, so I wasn't like privy to that stuff. But like I said, I just felt like it needed black and white artwork, and we needed like something that was gonna look like kind of those old like book engravings basically, like Gustave Doré and stuff like that. because I was looking at those a lot when I was writing, and I thought like, in a way, that's kind of like the vision of hell that like I vibe with the most. Like that's the kind of classic depiction. So.
And you chose to go with old school essentials. Maybe can you walk us through that decision as far as like versus Knave or Vaults of Vaarn style of system?
So I'm going to be totally honest. The reason basically is that OS, BX and OSE as it's cleaned up kind of version is, to me, it's kind of a lingua franca of like the OSR. Like obviously nobody agrees on anything in terms of system, but like it's as close to like an accepted universal language at the moment as we can get. Like if I give you kind of BX like hit dice and armor class and whatever and saving throws, chances are if you're running it with something else, you'll know how to convert it, because that's a pretty common conversion. So it's chosen like as a kind of midpoint of a lot of different design like kind of schools for, and it has kind of quite minimal like stat blocks as well. They're not like OSE house style. You literally get hit dice, armor class, like damage, morale, and then like description and like special things about the thing. But so it's lightly OSE, I would say, and it's not written in the house style at all. You're not going to see any bullet points or like bolding or anything like that. I kind of wrote in more like short like paragraphs and stuff, basically.
And so we already talked about it. It's going to be over 300 pages, 67,000 plus words, maybe.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned or joked about, the Google Doc broke. Talk about the other elements to the game.
Yeah, sure. So what it is basically is it's a giant dungeon in a way. It's a huge like hostile environment that you're trying to escape from. But you're only going to be able to escape from it by going deeper into the structure, understanding more about the creatures that live there and like the people that live there, and like finding your way basically to the pinnacle of it is how most people are going to get out of it. But because of its kind of scale and the verticality, like it's a giant like iron like thorn mountain. So mapping it with the traditional kind of maps was a little difficult, and it doesn't really fit like a dungeon map exactly. So basically it's a point crawl with like 4 kind of distinct regions. You've got like it's a giant kind of iron mountain sticking out of the ocean. So you've got the ocean and the islands around it and like the shores. That's like one map. Then you've got the interior of the Shrike, which is the guts, and that's kind of like caves, like mine shafts, kind of hell, like lakes of fire and stuff. And then you've got the exterior, which is like the outside bit of, and that's kind of more like mountaineering. It's like climbing a giant spiky iron mountain that's covered in snow with like weird flying devils and stuff flipping around in the clouds. And then when you get to the very top, it gets even narrower, and it kind of turns into a depth crawl, because like the kind of barb that's actually piercing the god is like constantly changing shape, and is kind of cast of this like weird kind of magical metal. So you're moving through this kind of like shuffling, like shifting, like needle of like iron basically up towards the god, and then there's a final kind of like capstone thing at the top of it, and then there are three of those nodes in the point crawl are like very detailed, are like fully detailed like dungeon locales in themselves. There's the Cove of Iron Coffins, which is like a starter dungeon for level 1 characters. That's kind of where you go when you start the game if you're doing like the traditional start. Gamagan's Starforge, which is like a kind of mid-level dungeon right inside the Shrike, which has some kind of light, kind of like puzzles with these like lanterns and like light and shadow. And the Palace of the Heart, which is a massive dungeon at the very peak of the thing, and that's kind of like a party crawl. The palace is like a weird one because unlike it is a dungeon, but it's not expected that everyone there will be hostile to you. It's a giant never-ending masquerade. So as long as you have invitations, you can go in and like join all the guests and stuff. But there's some puzzle stuff going on. There's 2 different like courts who have snubbed each other, and like they won't acknowledge the other's existence. So you can only talk to one of them at a time. And you're kind of like navigating a weird, like it's a slightly more Alice in Wonderland or like Beauty and the Beast kind of inspired thing, but with like a very different like tone. And like we said, there's a procedurally generated full like depth crawl inside the like barb itself as well, so you have to go through that to get to the top. So lots of different things, and I'm hoping kind of shows you like why there's so many words basically.
And then you've got some new classes as well.
Yes, of course. So yeah, as OSE is kind of racist class, obviously like the unique kind of creatures, sentient creatures in the Shrike needed their own classes. So you have the imps, who are like, they're the devils. It's part of hell, obviously, so they're the all devils are shapeshifters. So the imp is a kind of like shape changing like class with magic powers and some slightly odd restrictions about like crossing ritual circles and stuff like that, which can come into play. And the partials, which are made from, so there's a god stuck on the spike at the top of the thing, and the god's blood is constantly like running down inside the mountain of iron, obviously. And as we all know, divine blood can like give life to stuff that didn't have it before. So the god's blood kind of is animating like abandoned objects and like bits of wall or whatever that turn into these things called partials, which are like living human, kind of humanoid beings, but they have a lot of like whatever they were born from as well. So like, you know, if you're a barrel man, you're barrel-like in some way, but you're also like alive and animated by the god. And I think most importantly, you can create any kind of human class you want as an immortal sinner who is bound to the Shrike. And this is kind of what it's expected the kind of baseline play will be, is that you would be a human who like died and you ended up here. And the thing with the sinners is they have these things called like sin stones that are basically just black rocks like fused into their flesh. And they are unable to die. So if they die, the stone will like resurrect them, and there's no way of like stopping that from happening. And so you'll meet lots of characters who are basically like dealing with not only being stuck in this like horrendous place that's like all just made out of iron and stone, and like, there's nothing to eat, and you're always cold and hungry and afraid, but dying won't get you out of it either. You're just going to come back again. Which I think obviously is inspired by playing stuff like Dark Souls, where the resurrection is like a part of the lore. But I wanted to like bring that into the full kind of like campaign setting. So that's a kind of a pretty fundamental thing, is like, how do you escape from hell when you can't even kill yourself? Like, and there's a lot of characters trying to answer that question.
And you mentioned the god. Do you have like the background lore to that, or is it kind of left as a bit of a mystery?
So yeah, this is one of those things where this was deliberately left as a bit of an ambiguous, like, they're called the Nameless God. There's no like description of like what they are, if anyone worships them, or how long they've been stuck on this like mountain. In a way, it kind of like they've been there so long that it kind of doesn't matter. Like, they may not remember themselves. You can communicate with the god, and obviously it wants you to free it from the spike, which like you can do, but with consequences you may not like. But that's one of those things where like, because I don't know what campaign worlds people are going to be fitting this into, it felt like to me that might be a spot where leaving something ambiguous and like a little bit blank might be helpful for people. So there's no like backstory there really.
And so therefore they can bring this into their own adventure world, and like that their characters might be transported to somehow. Yes. With their own gods, as well as how would you start an adventure here? What would be kind of the premise of that?
So basically, if I was starting just a campaign, I would have them make like characters, and then just narrate a very brief like scene of them all dying somehow, right off the bat, and then I would have them wash up on the shores of the Shrike and like kind of wake up with the stones on them, and not really tell them what's going on, because the weather's so misty and cloudy at the base, you can't see the god when you're on the shore, so it's not immediately clear like where you are or like what the purpose of the thing is. But hopefully as they explore, they will like find more about it. If that doesn't appeal, there are lots of like other suggestions for how you can include it into a campaign. ranging from just putting it in the ocean in your campaign world to various like methods of travel to and from it that involve magical artifacts that like could be like you could find it in a dungeon and then be like, oh, what does this map do? Like, where does it lead us? And it leads you to the kind of pocket dimension with this like world in it, basically.
And then we also are on looking at the screen here where we've got 43 new monsters. Are they all kind of different tones compared to what you'd find in typical OSE?
Yeah, so it's not kind of classic Gygaxian kind of fantasy. There aren't any orcs or like, you know, kind of owlbears or slimes or anything. There are giants because I like giants. It's a kind of mixture of, so the Shrike was part of Hell a long time ago and like got separated from it. So it's a mixture of like stuff that lived in Hell, so like infernal kind of animals, and then the people and creatures that have like found their way to it like over the millennia through the kind of magical means that I described. So it kind of, the monster design, I would say, kind of trends towards some like body horror. Obviously, like there are humans here who are constantly resurrecting, but like after like millions of years of that, you kind of become something less than human. So the illustration here is like you can see a bunch of them all like chained together. There's devils, there's kind of like infernal creatures. There's different types of like partials, like the things that have been brought to life by the god's blood. So there's like men made of seaweed who are trying to strangle you, or like you know, kind of weird lumps of iron that are alive and like looking for people to put inside their furnaces to burn and stuff like that. A lot of it's themed around kind of like blood, stone, like iron, and kind of like flesh, I guess, like body horror. So a little bit different to standard OSE, I think.
I'm getting vibes of this particular illustration of the Paladin in Hell illustration. That's quite famous. I forget which book it came from.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Where he's
out as a poser.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to remember that off the top of my head. It's one of the old AD&D level books. There's a picture of a paladin in Hell, and he's just fighting off all these demons attacking him. I'm guessing this could be a pretty dark setting. There's not too many Rivendell's to take a respite at.
No, there are. So that's an interesting point, because like obviously when you're writing something like this, there is a question of both of tone, but also of like how like unremittingly bleak is this, and there are like attempts for kind of, I don't know, levity and like some aspects of fun. Like there are some characters that I think are pretty fun. Like in the illustration here, you got on the right, you got the cheese man, who is made of a bit of cheese that came to life, and he's very friendly, but just like smells awful, and no one wants to associate with him. So he's trying to like find some way of like masking his scent, basically, and that's his whole kind of little quest line if you meet him. So there are some kind of absurd like inhabitants, basically. It's not all kind of just like grim, but yeah. And there are as it says here, there are 5 like kind of devil court factions that you find who can kind of act as like patrons or like guides to certain aspects of the setting. And there are kind of settlements as well, although they are all obviously made out of like obviously populated by immortal humans who have their own kind of weird stuff going on. So you're never like quite safe exactly, even though you can find places to like rest and sort of talk to NPCs.
And you've also got some new magic items and treasures.
Yeah, sure. So this is this was kind of fun. So yeah, there's again kind of hell themed currencies, like magic items, various kind of weapons you can find. There's a couple of them that I was kind of pretty happy with that are themed around like obviously the idea of like the characters are going to be resurrecting from death rather than just being lost. So like there's a sword with there's like a dagger with 2 blades that if you kill something with it, you die as well. So like but it works on like everything. So if you're a sinner who can like resurrect, that's kind of that could be like a good option for killing some of the otherwise like extremely impervious like creatures that you can find, as an example of like a little bit of weird logic there. And there are these kind of you can see one of the horned masks, like all of the devils wear these masks that give them like a personality, and obviously if you kill a devil you can steal their mask and that'll give you various like things you can do when you wear them. So there's a whole kind of, there's a lot of magic masks basically.
I mean, I love all the kind of uniqueness to this. And how much of it was like ideas that you had going into the game versus how much did you like once you started working on the factions and the world and you went, oh, this would be cool. This would be cool. How much kind of discovery happened at that point?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It definitely like grew in the writing. I'd say what the way I approach stuff like this is you start with some kind of baseline ideas. So things like the devils with their masks, or like the sinners like resurrecting from the stones, were like, those are like really key like baseline things. And stuff like the treasure, that's for me, that's something that you add later when I'd written more into the world. And you're kind of thinking about like what's like valuable here, and like what would the creatures and people that live here like want to make. And obviously again, because it's hell, that kind of takes you in the direction of curses. So like quite a lot of the most powerful magic items have like weird curses or like downsides to them as well. But yeah, there's just little ideas that reveal themselves to you. Like the book you can see there, like one of the treasures you can get are these kind of ledgers that basically record like the deals with the devil that the devils have made with like living humans. And like the closer the human is to death, like the more valuable the like deal is. So they're kind of like these varying, these kind of books have like varying like debts like outlined in them in various like varying values. And that's kind of a thing that like comes from just thinking about like, well, like what do devils value something? They must like, there must be something that they want even if they don't spend money. And those kind of soul contracts seemed like one of the obvious things that they would be interested by.
So I have to ask the question, or maybe pose the question of like, I'm looking at the cover of this book going, that should be like an alternate cover for Shrike in the Kickstarter. Just throw it out there. Like one of those kind of ancient tomes. And that's kind of the feel that the whole setting has, is like this kind of ancient kind of like you found it in an old bookstore and blew some dust off, and you probably shouldn't have opened it, but you did.
I like that. Yeah, I think one of the big vibes is like kind of decay. Like one of the non-fantasy inspirations I had was just like kind of like old oil rigs and like stuff like that, like man-made structures, or like the old kind of sea defenses on the coast where I grew up. Like just these things that are like half sunken and like rusting away, like eventually to nothing, and they're covered in like seaweed, and like there's all these like crabs and stuff that live on them. And I always used to look at those and just be like, you know, fascinated by them as a kid. So it's kind of like a giant version of those.
And then as we get kind of close to the end here, just talking about some of the other inspirations that kind of led you to this, and we will flip through them a little bit. So when you started like really kind of fleshing out this world, how much did you immerse yourself into this? Like you mentioned your Pinterest board.
Yeah, no, I'm always looking at for me, as with Varn, I find like this kind of work starts with like imagery. So I would have a big stuff like Wayne Barlow here. He does like all these hell paintings, and like his hell is like different to mine, obviously, but it's a fully realized like world, and like, you know, could be an RPG set in its own right. Or these old engravings. Like I look at a lot of artwork for like mood, and like not thinking like I'm gonna find like specific scenes or whatever to depict, but something like this is definitely, or the Beshkinsky here. He's a really big influence. Like as Mobius is to Varn, I'd say Beshkinsky is like to the Shrike. He does all these kind of like nightmarish, like airbrush kind of paintings of these forms that you can't really tell if they're like flesh or like metal, like stone, kind of hallucinogenic, like this Piper. And there's supposed to be a little bit of that in the Shrike, with these things that are like being born out of the walls, and like all these kind of nameless, like pale kind of cannibalistic things hiding inside the caves and what have you. And or like Francis Bacon, just this kind of like, that's a good one to choose, all the meat and like hanging chains and kind of like the Silent Hill sort of like aspect. And just like a bunch of other fictional stuff, like the monster designs for Silent Hill, that kind of like those like kind of abstract, like almost abstract, like flesh and metal like together kind of things that don't really look anything like anything from other video games. The kind of Mad God, which is this kind of insane stop motion like film about a descent into kind of hell, which is definitely worth watching. It's kind of like 20 years in the making, I think, by the guy who did a lot of the animatronics for Jurassic Park.
Wow.
It's completely bonkers and wordless and just like really, really worth watching.
Wow.
Weird video game stuff like Majora's Mask or Dark Souls. I mean, obviously take $1 every time someone says they're inspired by Dark Souls now, but this is like my take on it. Yeah, the that kind of like decaying, like doomed sort of fantasy world that you see in like Majora's Mask and like Dark Souls is like a big inspiration, as is kind of the choice that you have at the end of Dark Souls, where you can kind of destroy the whole world or like let it change in a way that is ambiguous and like may not be great either. And the literary stuff like Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I love. It's a very short, weird novel about a guy who lives in this kind of like liminal space, which is this giant, almost like never-ending museum that floods with seawater. And that was very much in my thoughts when I was writing parts of the Shrike as well. Or on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of narrative, Piranesi is very like minimalistic and kind of enclosed. Kill 6 Billion Demons is this like insane maximalist webcomic, like martial arts story, done by the guy who does the artwork for Lancer, if you're any familiar with the RPG stuff. Pretty directly took my kind of conception of the devils from Kill 6 Billion Demons, in that they're like these kind of formless like creatures that are given like a personality by their mask. And other RPG stuff as well.
Wolves on the Coast, a very popular one, I know.
Yeah, so Luke knows that I love wolves, so I'll just say it again. Wolves kind of really helped me out, actually, because not that the Shrike is particularly like it in some senses, but one, that it's a very personal take on D&D and very expansive, but like the two main influences here are that Luke does not use the bullet point style. He writes these short, poetic, but like completely memorable and like striking paragraphs to describe people and locations. And I messed around with the style for the Shrike a lot, but stylistically, this is like my kind of biggest inspiration, I think. And also the really evocative and like interesting treasure and stuff that he wrote for the setting. I wanted to do my same thing for the infernal kind of regions. Emmy Allen stuff. These are the depth crawls, obviously. So this is the thing where like the Shrike originally started as like a hell kind of depth crawl, and these were like the sole kind of inspiration, and then it grew kind of outwards from that. But obviously these are really inspirational for that whole kind of way of like arraying like an environment, basically, which I did my own version of. And then Silent Titans and Veins of the Earth. Obviously there's lots of Patrick Stewart stuff to choose from, but these were like I think tonally, in that just they're so singular and like weird, and they're not really, there's not really any trace of like classic D&D in them at all, and they're so like their own like self-contained thing, that they've been really inspirational for me. And final, also Impossible Landscapes, which is not an OSR thing, but you definitely should read it if you haven't. This is a crazy like reality warping like nightmare adventure for Delta Green, where this kind of cursed play like kind of envelops the world basically and draws your characters into this other realm called Carcosa, which is among other things has a giant masquerade at the center of it, which I did the same thing at the top of the Shrike. So a bit of a crib there. Yeah.
So here we are at the end. We've got 300 plus pages, 8.5 by 11 sewn binding hardcover. So it's going to be a beauty. Black and white interior illustrations. How do you fill 300 pages? How much is art versus illustration?
I actually have no idea.
That's a Joel question.
That's a Joel question. There's a lot of words, but I assume we don't want it to look like a kind of phone book. So yeah, I don't know how many. I think if we hit a certain goal, I'm gonna be able to be hired to do some drawing for this as well, which I'm a little nervous about because John is like so good that I think going up against him is going to be really like that's a really hard act to follow. But I'll do my best.
Are we going to have to explain to younger audiences what a phone book is?
Oh God, yeah, maybe. So once upon a time, the phone didn't have a screen, and you had to remember the numbers, or you'd have them written down in a book. Because there were lots of numbers, it was really big, and that's how the phone book worked.
And then we got some stretch goals for extra art, extra adventures, as well as Silverarm books available. We already kind of mentioned a few of those, so I'm sure those will be add-ons as well. And yes. It launches Tuesday, February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day. This video is going to be out a little bit ahead of that. Are you excited? Like, how much do nerves play into it now? Or are you just kind of old hat at this? Like, yeah, whatever, God. I got this.
Yeah, I am nervous, but like, I'm nervous, but I think I'm confident. Like, I think we're not hiding anything. Like, there's been a preview available to read for a while that's quite substantial. Like, there's a lot of content. So, and a lot of people have read it and have said that they're excited for the full book. So, yeah, obviously, I hope I don't look silly, but I'm mostly confident that this is gonna work. And I think like. I know that I tried my absolute hardest with it and did like the best that I could, and I think I created something that's like kind of personal and like weird, but also as expansive and like fully realized as I was hoping it would be when I wrote the original like pitch document. So I'm proud of that, definitely. Whatever happens.
And I know my audience tends to be actually a lot of indie game designers themselves, and appreciate kind of some insight. Looking back upon your journey now between Vaults of Vaarn and now on the cusp of releasing the Shrike and your own personal novel writing, like, do you have any kind of advice for up and coming designers that are trying to get a foothold in the hobby?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I think of myself more as like a writer for this stuff than like a game designer. Like I've never designed like a full system, I don't think. Actually, no, I have, but never mind. I think my advice would be basically that like you need to like be drawing as widely as possible into your imaginary world as you can. So like I think you don't want your creative process to be an Ouroboros that starts and ends with the medium that you're working in. So it's like, obviously I've talked about tabletop RPGs when I talked about design for the Shrike, and like, obviously there are specific problems to the genre that like other people have tackled and you want to see how they've solved them. But for like the core kind of imaginative like meat, like the real like bones and flesh of it, they all come from like novels, poetry, like lots of paintings and like engravings and sculptures that I looked at. Memories of like my own childhood and like looking at these giant, what seemed to me like these huge like rusted like towers and stuff, as well as just kind of like just thinking of things that you'd like to evoke in people, or like that you're interested in exploring, and I can't tell you what those things are because they're personal to you. So like everything that I just talked about may be completely disinteresting and like boring to you, which is actually fine. Like there is. And the other thing I'd say is, like, in my opinion, we'll see if I'm right, like, don't aim for beige, like to me, Varn's bright blue, it's pink, and like the Shrike is like black and red and like gray. Don't try and be like a middle thing that you think is going to appeal to everybody. Like with all of my projects, I'm pretty certain that some people will just hate them because they're not interested in that specific like genre, and that's fine. Like you want to be, I think to stand out, you need to be aiming for something that isn't just like the middle, like of all colors. that's my kind of advice, I think.
Well, that's great. I'm really looking forward to seeing the Kickstarter launch and be successful, and getting my hands on the book myself.
Crossed.
And Leo, I just want to say thanks for coming on, sharing your history and your new work, and I hope to have you back here in the near future.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, Gary. It's been awesome. And apologies again for my my very dramatic lighting, but this is
it adds to the mood of the game. So check it out. The Shrike on Kickstarters. All the links are going to be below. Leo, thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.